by 1945, we were so pissed off at the Japanese. We had destroyed their Air Force, we had destroyed their Navy, we had destroyed their Army. The population of Japan was down to about 1,000 calories per person of the worst kind of stuff, buckwheat and weeds and whatever they could find. And yet they wouldn't surrender. And they still had 1 million men on the ground in Western Manchuria. And they only had about a year's worth of bullets left. I mean, we knew that much, but that's a long time with 1 million men. With that in mind, and because they felt that the Soviet Union was still neutral in the Eastern Front, because it had basically fought the war in Europe. We didn't win the war in Europe, the Russians did. We didn't enter the war on the ground until June 1944, by which time they were already moving forward against the German forces that had attacked them in 41. So we didn't win the war in Europe, the Russians did, but the Japanese just wouldn't surrender. And I mean, you can read the documents about the bombs. General George Marshall, who was leading the war, was in charge of all the forces, had this idea that maybe if we could use these bombs on the beaches before we landed to kill any Japanese defense that was there, maybe they would get the message and be shocked, he said, into surrender. But from the Japanese point of view, as it turned out later, it's a myth that the bombs won the war. They contributed to winning the war, but they didn't win the war. What won the war was when Stalin finally was convinced that there were such things as atomic bombs. He was half convinced these were American pieces of disinformation, that we were feeding the espionage to the Soviet Union to make him spend a lot of money and waste a lot of time for something that didn't exist. When the news came back, which it did almost immediately from Hiroshima and then from Nagasaki, that these things existed, he called Igor Kurchatov in and said famously, "Comrade, give us the bomb. You have all the resources of the state at your disposal. Give us the bomb as soon as you can." But up until then, he wasn't so sure. He had told Truman in Potsdam that they would invade Manchuria with fresh Soviet forces on the 15th of August. And Truman was trying to get him to agree to invade at all. And then when word came from New Mexico that the bomb had worked, which it did right in the middle of the Potsdam Conference, Truman then was trying to get Stalin to come in as late as possible because he figured the bombs would end the war before Stalin could take over enough of Japan to divide the country the way Europe was divided. He didn't want a Soviet zone and an American zone and a British zone. He knew we could do better with the Japanese than the Soviets would do. But Stalin, having heard that the bombs really worked, moved up the date of the Soviet invasion of Manchuria to the 8th of August, between Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and invaded early. I found it very interesting that the conventional air forces on our side staged the largest firebombing raid of the war on the 14th of August, after the Japanese were in the middle of their surrender negotiations. The Air Force wanted to get credit for winning the war, and they wanted to hold back the Soviets who were advancing down from Sakhalin Island to the northern islands of Japan, as well as inward from Manchuria. And so our bombing was in northern Japan. It was like a way of telling the Soviets, back off, buddy. We're not going to let you in here. And then the Japanese leadership, the military leadership, which had been adamant that they would fight to the last Japanese, the 100 million they called it, turned and finally realized that it was futile. That with the fresh Soviet army coming into Manchuria, with the United States and the British coming in from the west and the south, they were surrounded and there was no reason to continue. Yeah. But the bombs had their effect. The Japanese emperor used the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki as a reason for entering politics for the first time in Japanese history. He had always been a spiritual figure, but he wasn't allowed to kind of vote or veto the political arrangements. He stepped forth and said, we must sue for peace. And in his final imperial rescript on the 15th of August, recorded and played out to the people by radio, he said, a new and most terrible weapon of war has led us to think the unthinkable, and we must now lay down our arms. So the bomb had its effect, but it wasn't what we thought at the time. The scale of the bombing with one bomb, in the case, let's say, of Hiroshima, was not that different from the scale of the fire bombings that had preceded it with tens of thousands of bombs. The difference was it was just one plane. People don't seem to realize, and it's never been emphasized enough, these first bombs, like all nuclear weapons, were fire bombs. Their job was to start mass fires, just exactly like all the 6-pound incendiaries that had been destroying every major city in Japan by then. Every major city above 50,000 population had already been burned out. The only reason Hiroshima and Nagasaki were around to be atomic bombed is because they'd been set aside from the target list, because General Groves wanted to know what the damage effects would be. And the only way that he could study that, obviously the bomb that was tested in the desert didn't tell you anything, killed a lot of rabbits, knocked down a lot of cactus, melted some sand, but you couldn't see its effect on buildings and on people. A lot of Americans said, thank God for the atomic bomb because our boys came home. The actor Paul Newman was a friend of mine, and Paul was an 18-year-old bombardier on a 2-man Navy fighter bomber training for the invasion of Japan. He said to me once, Rhodes, I'm one of those guys who said, thank God for the atomic bomb, because I probably wouldn't have come home if we'd invaded the Japanese home islands. And 1 million men said that. And the truth is, there were so many Japanese who would have been killed if we had invaded, that even the killings of the 2 bombs would have been dwarfed by the killing that happened. Yeah. For the first time in the history of war, more Japanese civilians were killed in World War II than had ever been killed in a war before. War was beginning to become what it has since become, which is a war against civilians, basically.